8:17 a.m. A terrifying sentence begins flashing across phone screens. Francis Duru, now 57, is allegedly fighting terminal cancer, his condition said to be life-threatening. And then, almost without warning, an even darker version appears. Francis Duru is dead. If those words were true, perhaps no one would feel the blow more painfully than Adokiye Duru, the woman who has stood beside him through more than 2 decades of marriage. Imagine her seeing her husband's photograph surrounded by words like terminal cancer, critical condition, and death. Imagine the phone vibrating again and again, messages arriving faster than anyone could answer them. Is it true? What happened to Francis? How is the family coping? For several unbearable seconds, it would feel as though tragedy had already happened. But just before accepting what is appearing on the screen, one detail changes the direction of the entire story. Because the frightening question is no longer simply whether Francis Duru is dying, it is whether a living man is being forced to watch strangers manufacture his illness and even his death on the internet. The posts multiply. One image shows Francis beside Adokiye, smiling in a moment that suddenly looks painfully fragile when placed next to those alarming headlines. Another post allegedly describes a desperate battle with terminal cancer. Comments begin piling up beneath it. Some people pray. Others write farewell messages. Friends hesitate before making the call because they are afraid of what they might hear on the other end. The emotional weight becomes even heavier when you remember what this family has already endured. Francis and Adokiye lost their son Ifeanyi in 2024, a devastating absence that no parent simply leaves behind. Now imagine another wave of fear entering a home already familiar with loss. Not because a doctor has delivered a terminal diagnosis, but because strangers online are circulating a terrifying story about Francis himself. And then Francis speaks. In June 2026, he publicly rejected viral claims that he was critically ill, saying the frightening footage circulating online did not represent his true condition. He insisted that he had never been as sick as those images suggested and reassured frightened friends and supporters that he was still standing, still speaking, still growing stronger. Yet that clarification creates an even more disturbing image. Somewhere, a husband and father is alive while people are already discussing his final days. Somewhere, Adokiye can look at the man beside her and then look down at a screen telling the world a completely different story. So what was really happening to Francis Duru? Was there ever evidence of terminal cancer? Or had the internet created an illness, a deathbed, and a farewell before reality had even been allowed to speak? At 8:17 that morning, the phone is still glowing on the table, Francis's photograph remains frozen on the screen, and beneath it, one frightening question continues to spread from stranger to stranger. Is Francis Duru really dead? Long before frightening words like terminal illness, life-threatening condition, or even death began appearing beside Francis Duru's name online, there was another version of this story, a much quieter one. Go back to the years when Francis and Adokiye were students at the University of Port Harcourt, when neither of them could have imagined how many decades their lives would eventually share. There were no alarming headlines then, no strangers analyzing Francis's appearance, no phone screens filling with messages asking whether he was still alive. There were simply 2 young people moving through ordinary university days, gradually becoming part of each other's lives. Friendship became affection, affection became commitment, and eventually they began building something that would survive far beyond those student years. In 2003, Francis and Adokiye married. Years later, Francis would describe his wife not merely as his partner, but as his friend and confidant, someone whose presence made the difficult parts of life easier to carry. That detail matters now, because it changes the emotional weight of everything that came afterward. Imagine placing 2 photographs side by side. In the first, Francis is young, standing beside the woman who would accompany him through much of his adult life. Their future is still unwritten. In the second, Francis is 57. his face being circulated online beside disturbing claims suggesting severe illness, danger, and death. Between those two images lie more than 20 years of marriage, children, professional triumphs, private disappointments, ordinary mornings, and family memories that strangers on the internet could never fully understand. And for Adokiye, those years cannot be reduced to a headline. Francis is not simply a famous Nollywood actor whose name people recognize. He is the man whose journey has been intertwined with hers since they were young. That is why rumors about his health carry a particularly cruel edge. If Francis were ever truly facing a life-threatening illness, Adokiye would not simply be confronting the possibility of losing a husband. She would be confronting the possible disappearance of someone connected to almost every chapter of her adult life. But there is something even more unsettling about the situation that actually unfolded. Seeing a person you love still alive, while strangers construct a narrative of his suffering and possible death. Imagine Adokiye sitting beside Francis while a phone screen tells an entirely different story about the man only a few feet away. She looks at him, then at the screen, then back at him again. Somewhere beneath a photograph from years earlier, another comment appears, another stranger asking whether the terrible news is true. And suddenly the question is no longer only what has happened to Francis Duru. It is what happens inside a family when the internet begins writing a final chapter that the people living the story never wrote themselves. But there is a reason the rumors surrounding Francis Duru carry a weight far heavier than an ordinary piece of internet misinformation. To understand it, the timeline has to slow down and return to 2024, to a moment this family never chose and could never simply scroll past. That year, Francis and Adokiye lost their son, Ifeanyi, at only 15 years old. The publicly available accounts did not establish a confirmed cause of his death, and perhaps that unanswered space should remain exactly where the family left it. What is known is the grief Francis allowed the world to see afterward. He remembered his son with words filled with a father's love, calling Ifeanyi his champ and his lion, and saying that he would continue to love and miss him. Suddenly, Francis Duru was no longer simply the familiar actor audiences had watched on screen for years. Behind the performances, photographs, and public appearances stood a father who had faced one of the most devastating experiences imaginable, having to say goodbye to his own child. Think about what happens after the condolences become quieter. The visitors eventually leave. The messages stop arriving every minute. But inside the house, ordinary objects remain. A familiar place at the table. A photograph taken when everyone was together. A memory attached to a doorway, a room, a voice that is no longer heard. And then there is Adokiye. To the public, she may often be introduced simply as Francis Duru's wife. But inside this story, she is also a mother who had to continue living after losing her 15-year-old son. Husband and wife could stand beside each other, but neither could remove the other's grief. They could only carry it together. That is what makes the later rumors about Francis's supposed illness and death especially cruel. For a family untouched by bereavement, a false death story would already be frightening. For a family that had actually buried a child, those words could reopen something much deeper. Imagine Adokiye seeing a headline implying that Francis was dangerously ill, then another suggesting his condition was worsening. Then the most horrifying version of all, the claim that he had died. Even when such claims are unsupported, the words themselves can still wound. A family photograph that once contained everyone now already has one unbearable absence. And suddenly the internet appears to threaten another. Francis is still there, yet strangers are discussing him as though another goodbye has already begun. Adokiye looks at the man who once stood beside her through the loss of their son, while somewhere beyond the walls of their home, people are constructing another tragedy around their family. And on a screen glowing in the darkness, beneath an old photograph of Francis and Ifeanyi, two generations of the same family seem for one disturbing moment to be pulled into the language of loss. Then the pace suddenly changed. Images and footage began circulating online showing Francis Duru in a condition that some viewers described as frail, exhausted, even seriously ill. And on the internet, an image rarely travels alone. Someone reposts it. Another person adds a frightening caption. A third account repeats the claim with stronger language. Within hours, words such as critical, serious illness, and life-threatening condition can begin surrounding a face, even when the people sharing those words do not actually know what happened before the camera started recording. One person asks, "What illness does Francis Duru have?" Another wonders whether something has been hidden from the public. Then more dramatic content pushes the story further, until speculation begins to look almost indistinguishable from fact. But beneath the noise, one basic question is slowly being forgotten. What had Francis Duru himself actually said? That question matters because no credible public evidence established that Francis was battling terminal cancer. Yet for someone scrolling quickly through a phone, the distinction between a disturbing image and a confirmed medical diagnosis can disappear in seconds. Look at the photograph. Read the caption. See hundreds of worried comments. Move to the next post. Suddenly a possibility has become a rumor, the rumor has become a report, and the report begins sounding like a death sentence. Now imagine this from inside Francis's home, not through the eyes of fans, bloggers, or strangers, but from the perspective of Adokiye. What does a wife feel when she opens her phone and sees the husband who is still part of her everyday life being presented to thousands of strangers as though he were an anonymous patient approaching his final hours? What happens when photographs of the man she has known since their university years are placed beside words suggesting that his life may be ending? There is no need to invent what Adokiye said, because the question itself is disturbing enough. She had already experienced a real loss no parent should have to endure. Now the same screens that once carried condolences for their son could suddenly be filled with fear about Francis. Share, refresh. Another notification, another caption, another stranger asking whether he will survive. And the faster those posts move, the further everyone seems to drift from the only voice capable of confronting the story directly. Then, amid the growing noise, Francis finally responds. The man being described by others as gravely ill is about to tell the public what was actually happening, and what he says changes the meaning of those frightening images completely. June 19th, 2026. This is the moment when everything turns. No hospital corridor, no intensive care bed, no oxygen mask, no obituary. Instead, Francis Duru himself appears in a video, alive and speaking directly to the people who had been frightened by what they were seeing online. For days, disturbing images and dramatic claims had allowed strangers to imagine the worst. Some had looked at Francis's appearance and concluded that something terrible must be happening. Others pushed the story further, surrounding his name with the language of severe illness and possible death. But now the man at the center of the story was finally speaking for himself. Francis rejected the frightening narrative. He explained that he had never been as seriously ill as the viral images made him appear, and said that, by God's grace, he was growing stronger. His response carried something beyond reassurance. There was frustration in the very reason he had been forced to make the video at all. Francis condemned the disturbing content being circulated about him, describing such videos as wicked and criticizing the creation of negative stories simply to generate attention and engagement. And suddenly the entire story looked different. For anyone who had entered believing they were witnessing the final chapter of a 57-year-old actor supposedly dying from cancer, the reality was almost the opposite. This was a 57-year-old man being forced to stand before a camera and demonstrate that he was not dying. The words need to be clear. There was no credible confirmation that Francis Duru had terminal cancer. There was no credible confirmation that Francis Duru had died. On the contrary, Francis himself publicly rejected claims portraying him as gravely ill. Think about the emotional reversal. Minutes earlier, the images could make viewers imagine Adokiye preparing herself for another unbearable loss. Now Francis is there, speaking, breathing, answering the rumors himself. Yet relief does not erase what has already happened. A false story about death does not disappear simply because the person at its center says, "I am still here." Screenshots remain. Re-uploads remain. Old captions continue moving from one account to another, sometimes reaching people who never see the correction. Somewhere, someone may encounter the frightening version first and believe it before hearing Francis's voice. And somewhere inside his family, the knowledge remains that strangers had already imagined his final days, written the tragedy, and circulated it to thousands of people. Francis could correct the record, but he could not reach every screen. As his video ends, his face disappears into darkness, yet somewhere else another phone lights up, and the old rumor is still waiting to be opened. Perhaps the most painful part of this story was never the cancer that was not confirmed, nor the imagined hospital room that did not exist. The deepest wound lies somewhere far more real. Francis and Adokiye Duru had walked beside each other since they were young, from their university years into a marriage lasting more than 2 decades. Francis has spoken publicly about the reality of sharing life together, not simply celebrating the beautiful moments, but crying together and wiping away each other's tears when life became difficult. And then came a pain that no rumor could exaggerate. In 2024, their 15-year-old son, Ifeanyi, died. Francis called him his champ, his lion, and promised that his love and memory would remain. For Francis, those were not words written for an imaginary tragedy. For Adokiye, the empty space left by her child was not created by an online headline. Their family had already experienced a real absence. So ask a much harder question. What happens when a family that has survived an actual loss suddenly finds another loss, one that never happened, being placed at its doorstep by the internet? Do not imagine Adokiye crying beside a hospital bed because there is no verified hospital deathbed to describe. Imagine something simpler and perhaps more disturbing. Opening a phone and seeing the name of someone you love placed beside the words, "has died," while that person is still alive, still present, still capable of answering you. For most people, such a sight would be shocking. But for parents who already know what it means for one member of the family never to come home again, those words may carry an entirely different weight. A false death rumor can collide with a true memory. One name belongs to a son who really is gone. Another belongs to a husband and father who is still here. Yet strangers are already writing farewell messages beneath his photograph. That contrast is where the story reaches its most painful point. There are families that do not need a fabricated tragedy to make their story heartbreaking because they already carry a real empty space. Francis and Adokiye do not need fictional cancer, an invented terminal diagnosis, or a manufactured deathbed to make people understand grief. Their history already contains something far heavier. And perhaps that is why Francis's decision to appear and say, in effect, that he was still standing mattered so much. It was not simply a celebrity correcting gossip. It was a father whose family had already buried one of its own, refusing to allow the internet to bury him too. Yet somewhere beneath the video in which Francis speaks for himself, an older photograph remains. Father, mother, children together, captured before one chair in that family would become permanently empty. For decades, audiences have known Francis Duru through Nollywood, through characters who could suffer, collapse, disappear, or even die before the camera. That is the strange privilege of an actor. A character can take his final breath, the director can call cut, and minutes later the actor can stand up and walk away from the set. But the internet does not always give reality that clean ending. There, the boundary between performance, manipulation, and real life can become dangerously thin. One altered or misleading image, one piece of footage stripped of its proper context, one frightening caption suggesting a life-threatening illness. Then another post pushes the story further. Terminal cancer. Another goes further still. He has died. Place those fragments beside one another and suddenly they resemble a complete tragedy, a diagnosis, a decline, a final moment, a death, even though the man at the center of that narrative never told that story. Francis Duru had to step forward and challenge what people were seeing. Think about how extraordinary that is. A living man had to use his own voice, his own face, and his own presence to fight against a digital version of his death. He was not performing a Nollywood scene. There was no script waiting for him, no director ending the sequence, no credits reminding viewers that what they had witnessed was fiction. His real name was attached to the claims. His real family could see them. And behind Francis stood Adokiye and their surviving children, not supporting characters in somebody else's viral video, but people whose lives could be affected every time another stranger pressed share. They had already experienced what genuine bereavement feels like after losing Ifeanyi. They knew the difference between an empty chair created by death and an empty chair invented for clicks. That is why this moment reaches beyond ordinary celebrity gossip. A rumor about someone's death does not remain attached only to that person. It travels toward a spouse, children, relatives, friends, and people who may receive the frightening headline before they receive the correction. Francis could say he was alive. He could reject the portrayal of himself as gravely ill. He could condemn those producing negative content for engagement. But he could not personally knock on every digital door where the false version of his story had already arrived. And so, at 57, what Francis Duru was confronting, according to the information that could actually be verified, was not a confirmed sentence of terminal cancer. It was something stranger and deeply unsettling. Watching other people construct a version of his sickness and death while he was still here to witness it. His voice could answer the rumor, but somewhere beyond that voice, another screen was already lighting up. 11:21 p.m. The noise has finally faded. No hospital corridor, no ventilator, no terminal cancer diagnosis, no deathbed, no obituary for Francis Duru. Imagine instead a quiet family room after almost every light has been switched off. On a table sits an old photograph of Francis and Adokiye, taken many years ago when they were younger and could not possibly have known where life would carry them. They could not know which celebrations would eventually become treasured memories, which difficult days they would survive together, or which names would one day become painful to say aloud. Nearby is another photograph, this one of the family. Look at it a little longer, and there is a face that can now be reached only through memory. Ifeanyi, 15 years old when he died in 2024. Francis once called him his champ and his lion. Those words remain because the person they were written for cannot return. Francis had already experienced the loss of his parents, and later endured the unimaginable pain of saying goodbye to his son. Adokiye, too, had walked through years in which tears were not merely poetic words written in an anniversary message, but part of a life that had known genuine bereavement. Outside this imagined room, however, another kind of story may still be glowing on screens that have not yet been switched off. Cancer. Critical. Dying. Dead. Words can remain searchable long after the truth has caught up with them. But Francis Duru is alive. He personally rejected the frightening portrayal of himself as gravely ill and said he was becoming stronger. There was no credible confirmation of terminal cancer, and there was no credible confirmation of his death. Perhaps that is what makes the silence at 11:21 p.m. feel so different from the shock at 8:17 that morning. The imagined camera moves slowly toward the family photograph. It does not stop on a fabricated hospital bed or an invented final breath. It stops instead on the real absence already carried by this family, the place Ifeanyi left behind. Then the camera begins to pull away. No one says anything else. The phone lying on the table has gone dark. Francis and Adokiye remain somewhere beyond all the stories strangers continue to tell about them, living a life those strangers cannot truly see. And in that quiet room, Perhaps only people who have genuinely lost someone understand why seeing the name of a person you love beside the words, has died, even when those words are only a rumor, can suddenly make an old wound hurt, as though someone has touched it again. The photograph remains. The screen stays black. And somewhere outside, another unfinished headline is still waiting for someone to believe it.